My name is Gil Moshayof. I am a software engineer specializing in mobiles, mostly Android. And I'm here today to talk about my time at Waze. So quick overview. The timeline that I'm going to be talking about, 2015 to 2021, about 5.5 years. Locations primarily are in Tel Aviv and New York. During this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the main tech challenges that I encountered during my time there, personally or that I witnessed. Some basic general product insights and overall team dynamics, culture, that sort of thing. Kind of backing up a bit, before I started working at Waze, I was working at a company called Wix. For those of you who don't know, it's kind of a do-yourself website company. Probably some of you know I was working there. The goal there at the time was do a do-it-yourself app, kind of like in the same concept of a do-it-yourself website. Failed miserably, by the way, not my fault. So this was, I'm just quickly going to talk about this, kind of just a bit to talk about my context, sort of coming into Google and Waze at the time. So Wix kind of aspired a startup culture, and I love people that say, like when you're a company with like 300, 400 people, that we're a startup. I love that. There's always a catch, and with Wix there was a catch. The startup culture was rock up at 9 or 10, but don't leave until midnight. We have a fridge full of beers so you can get drunk. Great. And, take lunch breaks that are 3 hours long, but just live in the office. Wix was also the first place that I encountered the concept of a code review. I'd been coding for a long time already, but this was the first company that was doing code reviews. I've read about them, I heard about them. They were a really cool sort of thing that all the big boys were doing, and girls. But code reviews at Wix was probably the worst thing that I'd ever encountered. It was me writing a bit of code, then sitting down, putting my hands on my lap and waiting for my manager to sit down right next to me so we could go over every line of code. It was the worst thing imaginable. Crazy hours, like I said. Toxic culture, again, the expectation was just stay in the office and, even if you have nothing to do, just stay in the office, get drunk, and it wasn't for me. Some people might like that sort of thing. For me, it was really bad. Around halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, I got approached. One of the recruiters at Waze saw my GitHub, which had a bit of graphic rendering stuff, OpenGL stuff, which is what they were looking for. And 2015, I joined Waze. So real quick, just before we kind of get into my specific experience, what is Waze? So Waze, for those of you who don't know, is a navigation app kind of similar to Google Maps, Apple Maps, etc., except with the main difference that every single piece of data in Waze is crowdsourced, from the traffic alerts to the traffic itself to hazards or anything like that, all the way down to the map data itself. All of it is crowdsourced. In fact, this is how Waze got its start. So this was back in 2006. GPS back then wasn't really in smartphones. It was in these little devices that were stuck on the car window. The devices themselves were very cheap to make. What was expensive was the data, the maps. So a very brilliant developer named Ehud Shabtai, one of the founders of Waze, had this brilliant idea where he would install a background service on Android phones. Back in the time, Androids were quite simple, but they had the concept of a background service. He would install this background service on his friend's phone, and he would tell his friends to drive around. The background service would record GPS coordinates, send it back to the server, and it would plot roads, basically, like that. He would sit down, he would name the roads, and the idea was to sell this data to the GPS companies and make lots of money. Really quickly, though, the smartphones started getting better and better and better, and he joined forces with the other two founders, Amir Shinar and Uri Levin. And they said, why should we sell this data? Let's build an app real quick. They called it at first Free Map, and then they talked to someone from marketing, and they said, let's call it Waze, and they created that little logo. They got bought out by Google in 2013, $1.3 billion. They paid, at the time they had about 100 employees, they paid every employee an average of $1.2 million, which was the record at the time for that sort of thing. So when I joined in 2015, the first thing to hit me on the face were the perks. And again, coming from Wix, from these draconian hours, and like the biggest perk there was a fridge full of beers. So here the perks were, putting aside the generous, compensation packages, stocks, etc. There's cafeterias. The cafeterias were insane. There's like chef level food, and then there was a fireman's pole that you would slide down, and then you would get to the desserts place where there was like ice creams. It was crazy. It was kind of like the golden era of working as a mobile engineer or a software engineer at Google, that sort of thing. Absolutely brilliant. I started seeing people saying, I'm WFH. Today we all know what that is, but at the time I had no idea what WFH means. The concept that I can one day a week, twice a week, whenever, we could just work from home, that was incredible. I remember the first time I did it, I said to everyone, guys, I got a service person coming over, a plumber to fix something, please, is it okay if you don't mind? And one of my colleagues just said, hey, Gil, don't worry about it, it's all good, just say WFH. We don't care about that, all we care is that you do your work, deliver. We don't care about your hours. I remember sitting there in the office, 5 p.m., the office was empty. This was unheard of at the time, really. Code reviews. This is where I thought that I'd be properly doing real code reviews, but in Waze at the time, there were no code reviews whatsoever. And this was achievable because, Google was doing code reviews. There was a very elaborate system, Google 3, G3, something like that. The founders who were still working at Waze at the time had created a sort of bubble in Waze that prevented the Google takeover, so to speak. And that allowed us to keep our own repositories, to keep our own sort of culture. And one of those tenets was no code reviews. And this worked because we were a relatively small team, and every single one of us were really, really good at what we were doing. So that was kind of like my initial culture shock. Over the next year or so, I started finding my niche. My first project, my manager asked me to recompile our project to, I think it was x86 architecture. Our code had a big component of common code which was written in C++. And I said, sure, no problem. I had no idea how to do any of that. So obviously I started Googling and figuring it out. I was very, very motivated, managed to get through it in the first week. But that project was fantastic because it really gave me an overview of the whole project, right? When you need to start looking at how the packages are built, how the make files are working, how the make files are structured, it really gives you an excellent overview, not necessarily on the code itself, but on the overall architecture of the project. And I thought that was a fantastic first project. Yeah, so no code reviews. The code was a bloody mess. It was the main activity, the main sort of code file for the map screen where you would land on at Waze was something, I want to say, around 75,000 lines of code. It was a mess, but thank goodness for Control F. You could find your way around if you knew what you were looking for, and it worked. And that was just one part of it. So we had the overall structure of the code. So you know what, I'll get to that. In Android, those of you who work on Android, how many Androiders do we have here, more or less? Great, yep. So in Android, we have this thing called strings XML. Strings XML is where you would put all your copies, all your text. So if you have a button that says done, that done text is going to be in a file called string XML. And the reason we do that is so that it's easily localizable. We can change the languages, right? Earlier on at Waze, they said, nah, we don't like that, so we don't do that. Instead, we had a system wherein every single copy would be controllable remotely. So we completely ignored strings XML. The warnings in our code were everywhere over this, but we didn't care. Every single copy would come from a component inside our common code, which I'll talk about again in a minute, that was controllable remotely and A/B testable for different types of groups. So I remember we had on a sign-up screen, we had lots of users who would not pass through the sign-up screen because it would say sign up because we wanted you to sign up to sort of set up an account, or skip. And skip would mean just drive as a guest user sort of thing. And people wouldn't see the skip, and they would just delete the app and keep going with Google Maps. We did a test, and we changed the skip to start driving, and our conversion rates went up by 7.5% overnight. And we didn't have to release a new version, we didn't have to do anything, which was, I thought, an incredible sort of approach to the whole copies thing, as you could never do something like that with just strings XML. You would have to ship a new file, a new APK for that. The common code. So early on, it was decided, right, we have an iOS app, we have an Android app, we have a lot of business logic, we have, putting aside, server communication, putting aside the map code that is actually written also in C++, we had algorithmic pathfinding for offline mode. So there was a lot of actual business logic, raw business logic that needed fast computation. So early on it was decided that all of this is going to be written in C++, consumed in Android via something called NDK, the Native Development Kit, and in iOS, C++ just runs natively. So we were able to write, I would say something like 75% of our code was written in C++, all the business logic, all the internal sort of logic, server communications, the strings handling, configuration flags, analytics, everything was written in the C++ common code. Only strictly UI stuff was written in native layer, so in Java, Android for Android, and in Objective-C, later Swift for iOS. And it worked really well. And then the map. This is where I ended up finding my niche. I came already with a bit of a passion to graphic rendering systems, so OpenGL, Vulkan, Metal for iOS. Really interesting stuff. And I kind of found my niche there. At the time of my joining, the map was written in OpenGL 1. For those of you who don't know, OpenGL 1 is kind of an academic API, great for learning graphic APIs, but not great for production. But at the time also, when it was written, phones could only run OpenGL 1, so I mean, fair enough, that's why they used it. By that time, most phones were using OpenGL 3, all phones were using OpenGL 2, so that was my main project. I upgraded the whole system to OpenGL 2, wrote custom shaders, increased the map performance something like 10 or 12-fold. It was a great experience, and to this day, probably the funnest project I've ever worked on. But I won't bore you too much of that, because it's quite niche. So let's talk a little bit about the day-to-day. This was a great day. Conan O'Brien came to the office one day to do a bit for his show. You can look it up. I'm in there for a minute. He kind of has a joke on my expense. Very pale. So it was an open plan office, which at the time was awesome, but later I kind of hated. But at the time it was fantastic. It was very sort of non-hierarchical. So I sat in this spot. To my left, the CEO and the founders were, and I could hear their conversations, I could talk with them, I would talk to them about day-to-day computer games that we were playing or they were playing. I remember we ranted a little bit about, what was that game called, the Halo games one with the spaceships? I forget the name. No Man's Sky, that's right, yeah. No Man's Sky, that came out and we ranted about it because it was awful, but then it got really good. And it was really, the key thing here that everyone was approachable. The CEO, the founders were just very approachable. We could talk about things with them, we could talk about features with them. Everything was very informal. And it was just great in that sense. The tech leads, our managers, the software engineering managers were the tech leads, right? There was an Android tech lead and an iOS tech lead. And when we were starting to work on a project, the tech leads would act as the gatekeepers. So feature teams, designers would come with a bunch of product specs, and they would sit in a meeting once a quarter, or sometimes more than that, and they would sit with the tech leads, and they would present to the tech leads the design, the product specs, and the tech leads would either say, this is great, fantastic, everything's fleshed out, I'll move it forward to the developers, or they would say, this is not great, this will be problematic, take it back, rethink it. And the dev team was completely unaware of it, kind of umbrellaed from that whole process. Once a project would come through, a nimble work group, we call them, would form. Very informal, so it would usually be one Android, one iOS developer, QA engineer, a graphics designer, and a product manager. And the product manager's real scope would be to oversee the project from inception to delivery. But they were very informal, so it wasn't like you were assigned to this team and it was written somewhere on a big board that you were in part of these teams. In fact, the average programmer would probably be assigned to 2 or 3 of such work groups, plus they would have their own project, some sort of tech debt or some sort of project, dream project that they had. We'd sit side by side with the designer or with QA, and we'd go back and forth very quickly. Again, the whole no-code reviews let us work extremely fast towards really anything. And then the product lifecycle. So almost every feature we developed would be A/B testable, so we could feature flag everything that we made. But before it would go out to the wild, truly to the wild, this is where Waze's superpower really came in. So being kind of like almost a grassroots project kind of coming up, it developed a bit of a following. And one of Waze's really amazing superpowers is the beta community. Basically a fleet of people with every device you could imagine that would work for free, that would test our app for free, that would edit our map for free. I think around this time, around 2015, 2016, the beta community was about 20,000 strong. And they would test in every device you could imagine, every orientation. They would try everything you can't even imagine. Way more powerful than any CI/CD system that we use today that I can imagine. Way more powerful. simply because they were people and you could talk to them. In fact, we often did. There were often experimental features that we would send out to the wild, and we would developers communicate with them directly, ask them to test out certain configurations, certain locations. This is what enabled us really to kind of avoid having the code reviews and still write amazingly robust code, because we had this fleet of testers that would ensure the robustness of everything we put out. It was really incredible. So now I'm going to quickly go over a few highlights of some projects. This one is, I'm not going to talk about the map because that's way too technical, it would take way too much time. I feel like that's a talk within itself. But the voice recorder. So this was a great project. I think I was working on lane support at the time. And my manager, the tech lead, the Android tech lead, came to me and was like, Gil, come on, we're doing a hackathon. And I was like, all right. Went upstairs. A few floors, and people were just spitballing ideas. I heard someone say, what if you could have custom voices in Waze? So I said, son of a bitch, I'm in. So I went back down and started hacking away. So the voice recorder, by the way, if those of you who don't know, this is a system that you can record yourself, or your children, or your mates, or whoever, say, in 200 meters, in 300 meters. Turn left, turn right, recalculating route. And you can say anything you want, really, for these prompts, right? And you can make it funny, and it's really interesting. I went downstairs back to my computer, put aside the project I was working on. Fairly quickly, I had no idea how sound worked in the app at the time, but fairly quickly found one place where it funneled through, hijacked that place. Then I said, I know how to record MP3s, so let's quickly do that. Hacked together a quick UI. 2-3 hours it was done. Brought it back upstairs. Everyone was like, wow, I won a backpack, which is nice. It would have been nice to have a promotion, but never mind. And then we fleshed out the product, added a server side so you could share it. It was really, really awesome fun. And then the impact of it was even greater because it had amazing reception. There were talk shows that talked about it, radio shows that talked about it, and obviously no one knew me because who cares, right? But it was quietly, I kind of felt like a secret celebrity that everyone was talking about this project that I had worked on. The most amazing thing that we noticed was one of the most shared voice packs was a voice pack in Farsi, which is what is spoken in Iran. And Iran, I don't know if you've heard, isn't too friendly with Israel these days, or those days either. And so suddenly people in Iran were using Waze, and that was, to me, the most incredible sort of, who'd have thought? Another highlight of a project that I worked on, Android Auto. Android Auto is kind of like the Android side of CarPlay, the in-car system to use navigation. Android Auto had much stricter UI principles for navigation apps, or any app really that runs in it. But at the time, Android Auto was fairly new, and we were working on, Waze was the first third-party API to integrate with it. So we kind of sat with the Android Auto team. I spent some time in Mountain View, which is the Google headquarters. And together we helped sort of shape the interaction with the Android Auto, the API, the Google Assistant API with third-party apps. Really, really interesting time. This was around the time that I kind of noticed the main differences between the bubble that we had in Waze and Google in a more general form. Because again, because of the no code reviews aside, we could also iterate really quickly and release APKs, release builds really, really quickly, with several times a day if we wanted to. Whereas in Google, there were very heavy processes that controlled this, and it was heavily monitored. So it blew everyone away working with the team there, how fast I could generate versions. They would come back to me and say, we're changing the API like this, can you test it, see if it was okay? And this might have been at 10 a.m., and then at 11:30 I would send out a version, and it blew their minds. So I mean, processes are great, is kind of like my conclusion at the time, but then they do take something away that was really awesome to be able to do at Waze, at least for a while. Driver distraction was the cool thing. When we were working on Android Auto, there was this fake car that we would sit in, and we would run versions on it, and there was a camera staring at our eyes, making sure that we didn't look away from the road too much. So, and we had to have a level of driver distraction, a scorecard for that, and we had to pass that in order to be approved. Really, really interesting project. Then there's Carpool. I don't know if any of you have heard of this Carpool, the Carpool project in Waze. Anyone heard of it? Yeah, that sounds about right. So, the vision. So this was really our CEO's sort of vision of Waze in the future, how Waze thrives and moves on to the next steps. Because if you think about it, Waze's mission was to eliminate traffic. right? That was the mission. And it did well. It could predict traffic, it could moderate, it could tell you to go off main highways, and it definitely reduced traffic to a limit. But the vision was 90% of the time, I don't know the exact statistic, let's say 90% of the time, when we're driving from a residential area and we're driving to a commercial area, to the offices, from our home to the office, from the office to our home. Home to work, work to home. And usually we're driving where there's 5 seats in our car, but only one of them has a person in it. What if we could take 5 people, put them in one car, and get rid of the 5 cars? That would certainly do something to traffic, right? So that was the vision. And, Waze had the information. We knew, where your office was probably. We knew where your home was probably. So why not? That sounds like a quick, easy computer problem to solve. Just quickly write some code to say, you guys live together. Let's team you up. You guys work at around the same place. Let's team you up and, have one person drive and maybe get some fuel money back. And Waze takes a small cut as well. That was the vision. Right away, we could immediately see the strain. Right? And this is where our culture and the no-code reviews that work fast and get things done started to show cracks already. Because Waze, the back end, the front end, none of it was really developed to support this. I know that the back end had to be rewritten a couple of times because it was just not holding up with the strain. Turns out that doing this matchmaking is difficult. And we decided to skip the point of tooling, which was the hardest part, for at least from the client development's perspective, because if you have some sort of pop-up that you want to show, or some sort of experience that you want to have for a drive where you're picking up 2 people and then dropping them off. Those 2 people have to be real people, have to be real users. So you would have to sit and set up these users, and we'd have to set up their accounts and possibly also a mock bank account for them. And it would end up that we would spend so much time just working on this problem of just setting up a scenario and not enough time really working on it that it became untenable. At the same time, there were external issues. So, of course, people like driving in their car alone without strangers in it, apparently, which makes sense. There was also quite a bit of market saturation for ride-sharing in Uber, Lyft, so it was really hard to break into the market. Also, around this time, there was a bit of a bug going around. I don't know if you guys heard about it. The COVID pandemic ended up being the nail in the coffin. And this was at around 2021 already. That was when, Carpool was completely shut down. The 12 users who were using it were very disappointed. The CEO made his exit at around that time, Noam Bardin, the CEO. He left an op-ed, which I'll leave you guys to Google. Had a bit of harsh opinions on several things. But again, that's available online for those of you who are interested. And that was that. So that was a couple of projects, some cool projects, one not so cool project. Kind of rewinding a little bit, because again, this Carpool the project started at around 2016, maybe even earlier, and kind of went with Waze throughout the whole, sort of my whole journey, really. Around 2018, I made a move from Tel Aviv to New York. We were looking, my wife who's Australian, by the way, we were ready to kind of move out of Tel Aviv and kind of continue our journey. At first we were thinking to come back home to Australia, but kind of hard to say bye to Google. And at the time there was an opening for more leadership-oriented role at the New York office. So it kind of made sense to evolve around that way. But around the same time, a big paradigm shift was happening in Waze. So the whole tech-centric, tech as gatekeepers, tech control the code, no code reviews, all that was dying, mostly because of Carpool, but also other reasons. There was a big shift in tech to kind of, the bubble was kind of starting to disappear. Around the same time, the founders made their exit. A lot of the original developers at Waze were making their exit. And then, the product people kind of took over and code reviews started to become a thing. And this was actually quite a hard transition for a lot of the more veteran programmers suddenly started to get reviewed by more junior programmers. It was a big shift to make for a lot of people. But we got through it. Working far from HQ is never easy. So where the decision making was happening, the easy, the speakeasy kind of attitude where you could just turn to your left and talk to the founder or the CEO, that was gone. The overall vibe, it was really interesting. in a sense, working in the New York office was peak multiculturalism, so it was definitely a less familiar vibe, but it was more sort of official, more kind of less joke around, more business. It was also kind of went along with the internal paradigm shift of, product, and we started being divided into squads, official squads, that kept being reshuffled every 3 months. It was a bit of a chaotic time. Then COVID hit. And this was scary in New York. I'm not sure what it was like here, but in New York it was pretty scary. Suddenly, around March 2020, we got a scary email saying everybody's working from home permanently. I remember a few weeks later, we walked down to Times Square, and it felt like we were in the movie 28 Days Later. It was crazy. We played Among Us to kind of stay social with each other, and all kinds of like trivia games like that, just to keep the social aspect of it alive. And we got through it. So I'm just going to quickly summarize a little bit now about what I felt were the best things at Waze during my time. And I got to say, not having code reviews was awesome. It let us work so fast. Sure, it was chaos. The code was a mess. But that didn't matter so much, because even though the code was a mess, we could navigate it and everything was possible. In fact, not having kind of strict guidelines and strict architecture sometimes played to our benefit, because we could really move fast with a lot of projects. We wanted to strap on a new feature. We didn't have to make sure that the entire architecture could support it. We would just strap on that feature. It was great. Having code reviews was awesome. So the transition was definitely difficult from not having any code reviews to everything being code reviewed. But I think it boils down to what your product looks like, what your headcount looks like. But at a certain point, it was absolutely obvious, absolutely clear that we could not keep going on with the no code reviews. And then having code reviews, having a Garrett, we used Garrett, that was commit by commit code review, being able to really start to tell people, hey, I wrote a procedure for that already, you don't have to rewrite that, or having people tell me the same thing. It really did help a lot, and I thought it was great, essentially. So really both of them were fantastic, I thought. C++ for code sharing, so everyone knows about Flutter today, or React Native. C++ for code sharing has a lot of strengths, especially if you're doing a lot of performance-intensive work in your code. And I still firmly believe that pure native for UI is never going to be beaten by anything. And then if you're looking at code sharing, I think C++ is an extremely powerful tool. Last point, graphic APIs are freaking awesome. They are extremely powerful tools. Today you can use them for mining crypto coins or for traversing neural networks. Sometimes, rarely, you'll use them for actually rendering some graphics, which is pretty cool. And that's it. Then it was time to say goodbye. One of the key things for me in saying goodbye was the untenable structure. The squads that kept getting shifted. I was in a squad that was working on night mode in Waze, and every 3 months these squads were getting shifted, and there was no way we were going to finish night mode in 3 months. So I kind of joked, guys, maybe we should aim for maybe 2 screens or 3 screens night mode. And they were like, no, we got buy-ins from the top level, it'll be fine. 3 months, we're going to shift, mark my words. No. 3 months, we got shifted out. And every team, by the way, like clockwork. And it was getting a bit untenable. At the time, I remember I was interviewing outside of Waze in Google for Stadia, which was a really cool project, especially for my field, but that imploded also. Stadia, by the way, was a Google project for remote gaming, but that imploded also around that time. Facebook approached me. At the time, they were called Facebook, and I jokingly said, well, we're thinking about moving out of the States, so maybe if you have someone in London, I had some family in London, then sure. And they said, sure. All right. So I quickly did the interviews, got an offer. It was right at the Tech Talent Wars, I think it's called, where people were outbidding each other over programmers. Fantastic. It was a great time. They gave me a handsome relocation package, moved to New York, to London for Facebook. Spent there about 2 years, but I won't get into that right now because it's a story of itself. Eventually, we decided we had a little beautiful nugget of joy there, and we decided it was time to come home. And that brings us here. We moved back home, started working at ANZ, had a chat with Ryan, and now I'm standing here. The end. Questions?
You kind of covered it, but if you at a company, startup, would you go code reviews or not?
A startup? No. I would review the code of whoever I hired in the exercises that I would give them, and make sure that they know what they were doing. And then I wouldn't review their code. No. In a startup setup where I would have maybe a handful of programmers, no time for that. I would want to move fast. Yeah.
Did you have any CI at all?
So in the paradigm shift, when the bubble kind of disappeared, then yes, we started really looking seriously at testing. It was a huge uphill battle because writing testing in legacy code, immensely difficult in C++ code, immensely difficult in legacy C++ code, immensely difficult. No dependency injection, right? So we'd had a lot of code restructuring around our ability to write tests. And yes, we started to do that. In terms of CI, continuous integration, no, not to the point that I left, perhaps today, but at the time, no, because again, beta was just too much of a powerful tool.
You just threw the builds that...
We just threw out builds, yeah. About once a week, I would say, that you got to build.
Hi there, Francis Follows, the New York Times. Just wondering, you were mentioning about code reviews being something you were staunch on in like the bubble of Waze when Google was sort of taking over. Was there anything else you guys were sort of staunch on keeping around in terms of development process and development culture that you resisted away from Google's sort of way of managing?
So it was very, very informal. Our feedback pre-bubble exploding, yeah? Our feedback process were the lunches that we'd have together. And we just spitball, we just talk about very casually the work that we were working on. And then someone might casually mention, oh, I built something for that, oh, I built something for that. We knew each other's code a lot because we sometimes would sit next to each other and help each other, but it was very, very informal. And that informality was something that I absolutely loved, yeah, and it worked.
And how'd you find the efficiency of work post-bubble exploding?
Drastically slower. So slower, but the code quality was overall better. And we could ship things, and Carpool made progress. So there were things that we definitely couldn't do with that culture at that level, at that point. But at the point prior to that, it worked very well until it didn't. It worked great until it stopped working.
So you mentioned that at some point the devs were no longer in charge, like things were no longer tech-led. Who was leading things after that stage, like which function in the organisation?
Right, so the founders left. The founders being El Chaptai would be like the tech founder, the guy who really just sat in his room one time and decided to write basically the core code of Waze. The other founders, Amir Shinar and Uri Levine, who were more business-oriented, they led the ship, as far as I could tell at least, as well as with the CEO, Noam Bardin. But really in terms of feature instead of product, Noam Bardin's baby was Carpool, and they were leading the ship for everything else, right? And so they were leading in terms of, you know, what features we were interested in. El Chaptai was leading everything to do with tech. And then after that exploded, it kind of shifted. So they went out and there was a void. And the void was filled up by the product guys, the feature guys, the people who just dreamed about what Waze could look like and didn't really understand the tech challenges in Waze. But yeah, it was essentially product teams, head of product. Yeah.
So it's like a transition from tech-led to like product-led.
I wouldn't say a transition, I would say a coup d'etat almost. But yeah, sure.
Do you think so going from an environment with no code reviews, and I kind of agree that's like the only way that a small, fast-growing organisation can actually really operate and ship product fast and well is no code reviews. Sorry, not sorry. And then at some point you switch to like full Google-style code reviews, probably where everything's getting linted, and if a bracket's in the wrong place, someone throws a fit. Is there some like maybe medium where you could have maybe code reviews for like the important, high-impact stuff, and then some stuff just kind of gets pushed out?
So I don't see how you can have code reviews if not everyone is doing code reviews, because that's kind of the point, right? Everyone knows what's coming in, everything is sort of peer reviewed. Otherwise, if only one or two people need to do it, or certain areas of the code, maybe you could pull it off if you're just saying if you're touching this area of the code, it needs to be reviewed by someone. I think that's kind of niche. I think you're either going to do it or you're not. That's just my opinion. There might be other people that will believe it, that something in the middle is okay. But yeah, I think essentially it kind of boils down to planning, and that planning just being mostly on paper, agreeing on some sort of architecture, but not going too crazy because you're never going to anticipate all your requirements, never ever in a million years. If you're in a startup sort of notion, then just rush to the finish line. You can always rewrite, you can always refactor if it's viable, but don't waste your time in the early days, at least, I would say.
So I guess the takeaway from that would be, like, although no code reviews isn't scalable, there's kind of no soft landing into the higher scalability practice. It's kind of just going to be like...
Not from my experience, at least.
Thank you very much. Code reviews are great. I'll over there. I'm interested to hear the contrast you're seeing moving in ANZ from these other organisations, which I'm assuming is potentially a bit more enterprisey and maybe not as tech-led. And then, in particular, the practices or behaviours you're trying to bring across from your experience.
So I don't want to talk too much about ANZ because I'm still relatively new there. But just off the top of my head, we like to kind of compare code to things, right? To like a spaceship. So I would say ANZ's code, me coming in, code is very well established, very, very well architectured. It's like looking at a spaceship, whereas if I look at the code of Waze, it's kind of like Hogwarts, you know, where you've got shifting staircases and rooms that disappear and dragons that pop out. But I mean, as a new employee, especially one that's working fully remote, right? To add a room onto the spaceship, right? I'm going to take this analogy all the way. You kind of need to know how the reactor works, how the communication works. You kind of have to know basically how the entire spaceship works if you want to add a room to the spaceship. If you want to add a room or fix something in a room in Hogwarts, all the context you're going to need for that is going to be in that room, maybe in the talking painting right outside the room, right? So ANZ, very, very, very well organized, top of the line using, you know, Jetpack Compose and Kotlin and like, you know, Kotlin first. Very, very, very well architectured, I would say. But harder to step into, harder for a new sort of employee to step into and learn.
Just come to the present day. Let's say if you have to create a new app for ANC, it's a banking, it's an enterprise app. It's not like any maps or anything. What will be your suggestion, going native or cross-platforms?
Yeah, 100% go native. Yeah, I wouldn't use Flutter or anything like that, not for a banking app. Just the security level, the PII level, I want to have as much control as possible. I'll be frank with you, I once played around with PhoneGap. This is way ages ago. That was my last experience, and I ran away, you know, screaming. So I've always kind of shied away from Flutter and React Native, and I know they've come a long way. But if you're going to work on something like that in fintech, I would go native. Native is always going to be more powerful, no matter what.
You did a lot of work abroad. What would be like your view on working as a developer within Australia? I'm
quite new, right? And ANZ, I think, is not typical of every company. My experience of ANZ was very, very, very well thought out. Like I came in, ANZ Plus is very, 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 you know, built out and architectured, and you know, in terms of also in only the DevOps space, you know, they had like CI/CD, you know, Git processes, all very, very well established. Lots of text to read when I joined. I think I spent the first month just reading walls of text, you know. And I'm not sure if this is indicative of, in general, like Australian culture, or this is something more in the banking world, so it's hard for me to answer that question precisely. Maybe in a year or two I'll be able to answer it better. Thank you, guys.